Hello, and this will be a closer look on Docker Part 2. For this one, we will cover a lot of things that would be really important for developing a project, either from in the production or in the development part area. So the points that we're going to discuss about, the main points would be sharing images. How do you share your images that you have built to others, like to your friends, to your colleagues, to your team members? How would you share that image, and they would be able to build that image and run it as a container? Next will be, we have done one container, but how about we have several containers? How do we connect and run it at the same time? Then the last part is Compose, Docker Compose, which we will discuss later on what it is about. So yeah, let's go first for the sharing images. All right. For sharing images, let's use the previous example we have used for the closer look part 1, whereby we ran a index Node.js server on port 3202. So as a refresher, we built that image again. So you mentioned docker build within that directory, and then -t -t, and then you mention the name of the image. So you say Node.js image. So now we have an image. Listen, it's gonna build it using the configured file of the Docker file. Builds it, and then we could check it in Docker images. And here we go, we have a new image. Now to run that image to a container, we say docker run, yeah, and then we mention the name of the container we want to specify. So we say Node.js container, and then we mention the port. Remember, because of we are running on a port server, so we say so p-p. So we say outside, from the outside you could say 4000, like we're listening from the outside, from the host 4000, or we could say 3202. So in this instance we are going to do 3222, and then from the inside we say 3222, because that's the must, because we're listening on 3222. So here then we will mention which image it would be. So we have built our image as Node.js image. We mention is Node.js image. So it's running, it's going to run, and it's going to run on port 3222. So to verify that, we go to localhost 3222, and here we have our server running. So now stop it. So we check the PS. We see that it is still running, so we remove it by doing r stop and then Node.js container, and remove that one, which will be docker remove Node.js container. We don't want that container at all. All right. So now, how do we share the image to the other people? What we could do is two ways. Either you could share the project into a GitHub repository, a remote GitHub repository, where you're mentioning the project in the GitHub repo, mention which repository it is. Like for example, I have one here where it mentions the repositories I have, and then you just point, that person needs to pull that, and then compose or build the image that is within that Git repo. Or what you could do is similar to how we pulling that operating system base image from the Docker Hub. We could push that Docker Hub. We will discuss about it further. How do we push that? So, but first, what is the Docker Hub? What is this Docker Hub? So basically, what they say in Docker world, they mention it as a registry. So a registry means that a place where a server or website that holds the images as the images, and makes it similar to a repository, a GitHub repository. Now when you push it in the registry, another person, if it's public, another person could pull it for using the ID that you have given to the image repository. So in order to do that, for example, like a Docker Hub is a default repository, but you could create different repository, different registries, and you could do it for your own company. But in this instance, we're going to use a Docker Hub as the default. So register, sign up if you don't have an account, but if you have an account, sign in. And then it will show you the ID, and then you have to give the password. Now in your case, it will be in your main page you won't have any images, but we'll create a new one image to make an example for it. So you could see that for my images, every single one, for myself, every image has a tag of my ID. So the ID is the one that you have registered or signed in. So for every image that you want to push in, similar to any remote repository, you have to mention where you're cloning or where you're pushing. For example, like in this account I have Khalid Sub, so I want to push in chat app, so I say Khalid Sub / chat app. So in this one you have to mention the ID, the ID that you're authorized to push the image. So to give an example, we'll do that for our Node.js image. So now, for example, in order to push that in your repository, in the Docker Hub repository, you say docker login. And for my case, I already logged in, but it will ask you for your ID and your password. And then the moment you logged in, it will say login succeeded. Now we will go further. So let's check our images. So we could see that it's called Node.js image. So we have to rename it to your ID or Docker ID to an image. So I'll give an example. So when you could tag it with tag name, but we will rebuild it for just simplification, not too many commands. So we say docker build and then tag, and then you mention Sleeping Lotus for this instance, because that's my Docker ID. So I say Sleeping Lotus Node.js image. Now it's building it and it's renaming it, and we could check it out. So I say Docker images, and you will notice that there is Sleeping Lotus Node.js image. Now what we should do to push it into a registry, similar to how you push it in a Git repo, a remote repo, you say docker push Sleeping Lotus. So you mentioned the image itself, name. So if you're authorized, if your ID is properly written, it will say it's okay, I can push it in you're authorized to push in that repository, within that ID. So it pushed it. It said for my, like, I already have it in my Docker, my Docker Hub. So it said it already exists, so you don't push it. But in your instance, it will push it into your in your repository. And you could even see here, like, we have a Node.js image, Sleeping Lotus / Node.js image. You will have that when you push it, this would be showing to you with your specified ID, say Docker ID. So that's about sharing images. So either using Git repo where you pull it and then build it locally, or they could pull that image, and then, like, to pull that image itself, what you have to do is docker pull and mention what the ID of your image is. For example, in my instance, it will be Sleeping Lotus Node.js image, and then it will pull that image into your local. So it will check in as a default in Docker Hub, and if it finds it, then it will take it, and then you could just say docker run, like another person could do that. So that's about it about sharing images. Now moving on, we'll go towards running several Docker images. So in this instance, I already made a project for this example. So what we have here is a Node.js server and MongoDB. So let me show you. All right. So we have a Node.js server running at 3404. So that doesn't matter which port is running. So it's running on, doesn't matter. And then on the database, it's running on 2717. Normally, when you have the MongoDB running, right, on your when you installed in your local, you mentioned localhost port 2717, and then and you run it similar, like I have already, you don't have to install it, but I already have it installed. So this will be listen. So when you say yarn start for the server, it will connect to 2717. Notice the slight connection coming from here. You notice that it's something updated, so that means it has connected with the Node.js with the MongoDB, because of, we mentioned it's localhost on port 2717. So what is the localhost? What is the localhost? What they meant in order to understand how to run several containers. But what we want to do is we want to run Node.js as a container and MongoDB as a container in this instance, because for example, like you have several servers that are listening to MongoDB, so you want to have one container for that instance. So let's close this down. Let's cancel. So localhost, for instance, in our network, in our laptop, what it means is port, like the address is 127.0.0, so it means it's a loopback. So the illustration is a simplified version, and whoever is into networking, please don't kill me, because because I made it simple and I'm not into networking. So just to illustrate as a simple instance, so when Node.js is pointing to localhost, like which is my IP address of 127.0.0.001, so it will say it won't go outside of the, normally it should go outside, but when you say localhost, it means it's within that host network, which is your laptop or your server or your whatever device you have. Is localhost will be within your laptop, within your network. So when you say localhost, it will check any port that is running. For example, we said 2717, and then it will check a port within your host network if there is any if there is, for example, a MongoDB running on 2717. For example, if it's a MySQL one, it will be 3306, basically port 3306, and it will point towards that MySQL server. So now that's normal, that's how it's connected. But okay, but when you are running, for example, in order to have a MongoDB container, let's check in the Docker Hub. So let's find image similar to what we have done to Alpine. So there is a MongoDB image that you could use instead of installing the and configuring the database. You could just pull it up and then run that MongoDB. So here we say docker run mongo. So you mentioned as well mongo name MongoDB. No, not Mongo. Then you mentioned the port that you want to listen, the database is listening, so it's port 2717, and then you mention from the inside it was 2717, and then you mention as well the image that you want to point towards. So for instance, it's saying Mongo. So here, when it doesn't find the Mongo locally, it will as a default pull it from the Docker Hub registry. So as you could see, even unable to find Mongo latest locally, so it will pull it from the Docker Hub registry. So it's pulling out, and then while it's happening, we could continue with the discussion of the without Docker and with Docker. So without Docker, basically the Node.js server will listen to the localhost, which is within the network, and it will point towards to a port that is called 2717. But when you run this instance, when you say localhost within the Node.js server with Docker, what happens is, sorry for this. Okay, yeah. What happens is with Docker, when you say, see, remember, a container acts like a server, right? So when it acts like a server, that means when you mention localhost, basically it's pointing towards himself. So Node.js container, so when you mention it is a local host network, remember, okay, you have to take note of that, because this is really important. You might mess up in your production. So when you say local host, for example, in this instance, we say localhost 2717, it will check within the Docker container, but it won't find any port running, anything. No, it won't find anything running on this port, because like it's a different container, because we want to separate the MongoDB, for instance, as a server. But if you install the container, like with a database within the container, it will point towards that 2717. But in our case, we have it separated. So when it's saying localhost, it will point towards the local local network of the Node.js container. Similar to what we are talking about, the host network, it will talk about as well within that Node.js container. So it's running now. Now the MongoDB is running. We could see now when we try to as well run this project. Let's run this. Like, okay, we need to build it, like Docker build, and then say Node.js MongoDB. Now Node.js API image. So Node.js API, and then that's the tag, right? So I'll say the tag is alright. Then we will run it. Okay, we build it, and now we are going to run it, Docker run, and then you mention the name. So we'll say Node.js API container, and then you mention the port, which is listening to 3404. So from the outside, we will listen on 3404 as well. If you want to, you could change it. Like, you don't have to be dependent on it. So you could say outside 3000, 4000, 5000, doesn't matter. The only important part should be within the Docker container. You mention 3404 because it needs to be opened at that moment of time. So then you say Node.js, the image you're pointing towards, which is API. It's running, it's going to run, but nothing is going to happen. It will give an error when it tries to connect with the database and create a document. So when we run it on 3404, let's update that. So let's say 3404, it's loading because it's not finding. Previously it connected, but now it's not connecting because it's because it's even giving me an issue. Operation cat insert one buffering timed out, so it didn't connect at all with the database, because the reason being localhost is within the container. So now the concept is, let's say a container, we mentioned a container mirrors similar to whatever server you have, whatever laptop you have. It mirrors and it's isolating your project or your project into a semi-like virtual machine, right? So a semi-like virtual machine should have ports open. As you could say, like, we were opening ports, closing ports, we're running on ports, it listens to ports, and as well it has a shell, so you could execute some stuff within that, similar to an operating system. You could do PowerShell, you could do shell, it doesn't matter, it depends on the operating system you're running on the container. And again, since it acts like a server, right, it has an IP address, right? So that's the best part. A container has an IP address. To verify that, we check Docker network. There is a command called Docker network, but you have to say Docker network ls. So as a default, there are several networks, right? So for example, there's non-host bridge. So as a default, for example, this container, MongoDB container, it's going to run on Bridge. Usually every container that you are creating without any network, it will be built in the Bridge container. In this Bridge network, it will create a Bridge network. So when we check on the Bridge network, say docker network inspect Bridge, right? So now there is so many information, like it will mention the driver they're using, the IPv6 address. It will mention as well the gateway, like a normal server IP address, like a laptop or whatever. Like it acts like a server. So basically, it's checking the gateway of the network, and then MongoDB. Do you notice that's the container name of our project? So name MongoDB, then you see there's an IP address. So what we could do, right? So you could see the moment that you create a MongoDB container without any network, it will, as a default, create it in a Docker network, wrap it around within a Docker network, and point to each container an IP address. So what we could do to solve this issue, we have a Node.js container, right, within the Docker network, and a MongoDB container has a network. So we could, instead of pointing to a local host, we should point towards to an IP address, and this IP address will point towards that server. So like this server will connect to another server within that IP address. So we could say, so in this one, I will try to use, you could use this index, but I will try to use for my, like I want to learn more about Vim, so I'll use index Vim in this instance. So you could change it to the, so you see, okay. I'm still not used to it, how to use Vim. So L, and then I mentioned, okay, change it to the IP address of this, the MongoDB IP address. So how would you know which IP address it is? So check Docker. You could check Docker network, again inspect, and then Bridge. So that we could see all the image IP addresses that is happening. So we say 172.17.0.2. So we should change it to 172.17.0.2. Now let's save that. Let's escape. All right. So now let's run it by saying docker, let's build it first. So t Node.js API, and we could say docker, first we remove the previous container that has been running, Node.js API container. Okay, then we run that thing, which is docker, is there like, yeah, let's just say this way, like we didn't change anything, right? 3444. Now let's run it. Yeah, now it's listening on port 3404. Now when you refresh it, you could see it changed, right? So when you check it, it's creating new images, like new documents. In this endpoint, I mentioned whenever you say / it will create a new document. It didn't give us any error. So you could see that when you point towards the IP address, which is in this instance the 172, when you point towards the IP address instead of the local host, it will work. So basically, you just have to mention the IP address. But isn't that too much though? So what we could do in this instance, to simplify, because IP addresses changes the moment you create a new container, the IP address might change. So sorry to nerd out in the Docker network. So let's stop the project and say docker stop Node.js container API container. All right, and then I want to remove it, the container as well. Docker rm. Remember, you have to remove it as well, so in order to create with a similar name. Now what we should do is, instead of writing this way, what we could do is, instead of mentioning the IP address, because IP addresses are volatile and they might change over time, so what we could do is write the container name itself. So let's say MongoDB is our container name. You could see that's the name that we have given. So you mentioned MongoDB port 2777. So now, okay, so I need to escape WQ. Now it's saved. So we have changed it to MongoDB at port 2772. So now what we have to do, okay, now again we have to build it again, right? So let's build it. Now we have to add a new command for this instance. What Docker will do in this one, so we say run again, right? Docker name, Node.js container, port at 3444, and Node.js API. Now we have to mention link, which means link it with, okay. Let me clean it up because it looks okay, clear. Okay, now you say docker run, right? And then you mention the name, Node.js API container, whatever you call it. So I'll mention it Docker container. Now what we say is port, right? 3444. And normally what we should do is like Node.js API, which is the image, pointing towards the image. Now there is another thing called link, which is linking or saying link towards that container. So you mention link and then you mention the Docker container. What it does in this instance, and then you mention the Node.js API. What it does in this one, it will replace the MongoDB. So what Docker will do, it will check if there is any Docker container name with this one and replace it with the IP address of that container. Now if you run it, 3442, you didn't even have to mention the IP address in this instance, right? So you could say, now let's refresh. You could see it's running. So there's another endpoint to check our documents, collection of documents. You could see there's many documents we have. So it's connected. Again, it's connected because of we mentioned link MongoDB Node.js. So it's saying link with within that network, if there is within that network a container that is called MongoDB. So it found it and then it will replace that MongoDB name into the IP address dynamically without you worrying about the dynamic changes happening with the IP address. So now to recap, no, actually recap is too long. So now you could see how crazy you could go. Like now you could even make more crazy where you have more commands. Now, isn't that too much though? Like it's difficult to remember everything, right? Isn't it difficult to do those things? So now there's something called Docker Compose. So it reduced these problems we have whereby you are mentioning everything in one thing, right? You have to remember which port it is and everything about it. And yeah, it's kind of like time consuming. So what we could do is use something called a concept called Docker Compose, composing within a file. It's similar concept where instead of now we have here one file for one container. What it does is running several containers at the same time. So let's create a file. It's called Docker Compose.yaml. So it has an endpoint called YAML. So let's check to, I think that's difficult to insert in this one. So let's just, I'm still in comfort zone in this one. So what we should do, we mentioned the version. which is 3.7, 3 point whatever you call it, like above, like it should be above 3.3, above and beyond. So now we could, that's 3.7. Now we say services. That's the services of the containers we want to run. For example, we want to have a Node.js API. You mentioned here a Node.js API. Then you mentioned, so you mentioned the Node.js API. Then what we should mention is the container, not here, yeah, container name. And the container name here is like Node.js API, right? So similar to what we've done, like the name, like dash a name and those stuff. And then as well, now there is something called image as well. So you could say no image, and then we can mention what the image will be. So we say Node.js. Ah, yeah, forgot. Still bad that Vim. It's kind of bad. API container. Okay. Still so bad at Vim. Alright, so then the container and then image, we mentioned it should be Node.js API, similar to what we have done. And as well, what we could say is the port. So we'd say, now here is, you know, it's using the YAML language, so it's similar to any markup language, so it has a specific way of doing it. Like JSON, it has a specific way you have to put in, so it's easy to figure out. So you check it out. Maybe you were a Flutter user, you might just know what YAML means, so you could use that similar concept. So you just use those concept in it. So what was the port? 3400 for the outside and 3400 from the inside. So that's for the ports. And then yeah, that's about it, I guess, for the Node.js API. Now we have a MongoDB, right? So now in this one, oh yeah, before that we have to mention as well, like it depends on the MongoDB. So here we mentioned the container, which will be MongoDB, and the image was Mongo. From the outside, right? It's called Mongo. So if it doesn't find it, we will use image Mongo. And anything else, I think, yeah, ports. So I think they mentioned you as a default it will do the ports for you, but for best practices we'll use the ports. So you mentioned 2717, yeah, with a string, as a string 2717 port from the inside and then from the outside. Now we save it, and I think yeah, we're good to go. Now let's stop everything. Let's check what we have running. Docker stop, MongoDB, JDocker, Docker stop MongoDB, and Docker remove MongoDB, and Docker stop Node.js API container, and Docker rm Node.js API container. Stop everything into this. Now we don't have anything to verify that. Let's use it. Now what we could do, we run this Docker compose. So you just mentioned Docker compose, and then you mention up means running all the containers running, right? And the -t means like don't show it in the command prompt. So if you mention just up, everything will be running on your command prompt. So we just wanted to, okay, for this case we could just say docker compose up. Compose file doc is invalid because unsupported file MongoDB. I think yeah. Yeah, I said container. It should be container name. Yeah, sorry about that. Container name. container name. Alright, now let's compose it up. Is invalid because an option for services depends on it depends on, like sometimes you get the mistake, but yeah, Docker is good. They're telling us what the issue is. So it's creating, it's running everything with the MongoDB. Everything is running. You could verify that by saying docker ps. You could see, right? So now let's run it on port. Let's run it. You could see running, easy as that. So what did we do? We just run this file, right, and said docker compose up, right? Now to close it down, you don't say docker rm and docker stop and those stuff. Well, we could say docker compose down. Now everything will be stopped and removed. So to do it, like you don't want, see, you could see like everything is closed. We could even try it out. It's loading because it's not running. We could even check it out, docker ps. Here we have learned that you could run everything in one file, easy as that, without doing the stuff that we have made. But it is great for you to understand the command prompts, so you don't have to be dependent on the file or create that file in order to make it work. Now what we could do, even much more simpler, what we could do is specify that we could mention build here, build, right? So we could mention the docker file for this one. So it will be docker file. We specify the docker file here, and we mention as well the context, which is which directory will be. You mention it is this in this current directory. What it does, it will run the docker file, builds it for you with the given name. Yeah, in this one, Node.js API. So if we mention here like API 2, right? So it will create an image that is Node.js API. To verify, we say docker compose up, and then we just don't want to have it on our command prompt. We say -t. So it's building. You could see from Node Alpine, it's building the file, compiling, building, and then it creates an image called Node.js. Now we could see that by checking docker images, Node.js API 2. You could see that 9 seconds ago, and we could check the PS. It created it, right? So I think that's about it. Oh yeah, one other funny thing what you could do is one other addition. Okay, this will be the last one. What we could do is, now let's just go docker compose down. You want to share the images, right? What we could do in this one, what we could mention, okay, remember we have to put the docker ID, right? Sleeping Lotus. No, not the container, but here. So you say sleeping Lotus / right? So you mention sleeping Lotus or your docker ID, and the container name already exists, so they could just copy that file. So now, so you said docker sleeping Lotus, right? So we call docker compose up again. It creates that image with that name. It builds it. Now what we could do to push it to a different registry, we say docker compose push. It pushes the image that you have prepared. Instead of saying docker build and then docker push, you could just say docker compose push, and it pushes the images that you have made. For example, this one is coming from the community, so it doesn't push it, but if you have several images that you have created, it will push it into a register. So I think that's about it. I hope that everything was okay. So yeah, thank you very much for listening and hanging in there. Yeah, that was a long one. Goodbye.